Hello, everyone, and welcome to this 1 hour session for the Bradford Literature Festival. As you can tell, we can't be with you in person as we ordinarily would be, but we have an hour to talk about all things Anne Brontë. This is about Anne Brontë in her own words, but to provide their own insight and scholarship, we have three amazing speakers who I'll introduce in just a moment. My name is Bidisha. I'm a journalist and broadcaster, and it gives me huge pleasure to welcome today's panelists. We have Adelle Hay, the author of Anne Brontë Reimagined, A View from the 21st Century. We have Samantha Ellis, the author of Take Courage, Anne Brontë and the Art of Life. And we have Marianne Thormählen, a Brontë scholar and the editor of The Brontes in Context. All are extremely seasoned and passionate scholars, commentators, writers and speakers. And as we go on for the next hour, you're going to see just how much insight they have and how we're going to open up the conversation around Anne Brontë. We have also suggested that if anyone has just perhaps 4 sentences of Anne Brontë in her own words, we might just drop those into the conversation whenever we need reminding about who exactly we're talking about and why her work is so interesting and important. But I'm going to leave that to the panelists. Let's get right into it. I think, Marianne, if we start with you, who is Anne Brontë to you? Why were you drawn to her work?
Like many other people, I think, I discovered Anne Brontë quite late. With Charlotte and Emily, you read their great novels in your teens very often. But Anne Brontë tends to be an acquired taste on the part of the mature, and that was certainly the case with me. I first came across her writing when I was in my mid-30s. I was on holiday with my husband, who always sleeps longer than me in the mornings, and I brought The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, which I hadn't read before, because I thought, yeah, this might be a good read for a week's holiday. And I was completely engulfed by it. And I used to get up early in the morning and nip off into the loo, sit on the loo seat and read and read and read until my husband woke up. So that was the way I discovered Anne Brontë. And I knew I wanted to do something with her writing of a scholarly nature. But when I started to look at it more closely, I found that what I wanted to do with Anne hadn't been done with Charlotte or Emily either. So she made me a Brontean. I came to the Bronte sisters through Anne.
We're going to come back to all of your points. I just want to bring in Samantha Ellis here to ask who Anne is to her. I'm suspecting that we all have our own Brontes who are our sort of imaginary friends or literary friends. Who is she to you?
She's become a great friend to me and a comfort. And I read her young and misread her. I mean, I think Marianne is right. She grows on you. I maybe needed to grow up to read her. I definitely need to grow up to read her. Actually, I definitely did. And I'd heard that she was the boring one, the less talented one, the meek one, and often used in a derogatory way, the pious one. I don't use it in a derogatory, but people were using it that way. And I thought she sounded really boring and I wasn't into her. And then now I'd say she's the radical one. She's the courageous one. She's a feminist. She's got a quiet strength. It's true. She's not a shouter. She's the one who also really was in a way the most isolated at many times in her life, and the most she was the one who knew she was dying and had seen Emily die of the same thing and had to face it herself, knowing exactly what the stages it was going to go through. So towards the end of her life as well, she showed great courage. And she is also incredibly hardworking, incredibly committed, and I'd say passionate, but again, in a sort of quiet way. She's not running around on the moors, though she did that too. But
Adelle, I want to bring you in here and also just maybe point our attention towards Anne Bronte's work itself. Why were you drawn to the writing of Anne Brontë?
I think similar to everybody else, I came to Anne Brontë very late, much later than I'd come to Charlotte and Emily. I'd been led to believe that she was the boring Bronte, less talented. Don't read her work, she's too preachy, that kind of thing. So when I did finally read her novels, I was completely blown away. You know, not only is she writing about very controversial issues at the time, things that are still quite controversial now, she was writing very realistic narratives too. We even get, you know, a full-on kiss in The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, which isn't something that really happens in any of the other Bronte's works. And the more that I read Anne's works, the more I thought to myself, why on earth does everyone have these very conflicting opinions of her? And that made me incredibly interested in how people, or how writers, are edited after their death without their knowledge, without any kind of consent. And I wanted to learn more about how Anne's literary agency was kind of taken away from her when she didn't have, she couldn't consent to that. She couldn't, you know, say, please don't do this to my work. And that's something that I'm currently, you know, researching at the moment.
Marianne, let me bring you in here again, because now we have an opportunity to gain an oversight of Anne Bronte's actual writing. Most lay readers will know her through the novels, but she left a lot of other output as well, letters, poetry, juvenilia. I wondered if you could give an impression of the sort of the shape of Anne Bronte's writing, if we were coming to all of it now.
Well, we're handicapped by the fact that we don't have any prose juvenilia by Anne, the way we do by Charlotte and also, of course, by Branwell. So apart from a couple of letters, and Samantha has brought out so strongly the effect of the most moving, her last letter, on her, and I should think that echoes with a number of readers. But apart from that, we have only her poetry, which I like a lot, but it's not, I think, as distinctive, as powerful as her fiction, and it wouldn't be fair to compare poetry with fiction anyway. But I would say that it wouldn't be a great loss to the world if we didn't have Anne Bronte's poems. It would be a shame for us who love her. But if her fiction were to drop out of human ken, then that would be a disaster. The poems are, they're clear, they're limpid, they're very honest, and very autobiographical, I think. When it comes to fiction, it's another thing, but the poems are about her and about her experiences. And of course, there are Gondel poems there also, but as sometimes happens with Emily's poems, I think there are Anne's poems by Anne on Gondel or in the Gondel context that are also about her. So I think she's an autobiographical lyrist as a writer of poetry. But she really isn't in Emily's league as a poet. That, I think, must be acknowledged.
Adelle, I want to bring you in here because, as everyone has alluded to, the Brontes tend to get lumped together, particularly in the minds of GCSE and A-level students who are sort of working their way through the canon. I wondered if we could sort of begin to distinguish a little bit between the three sisters and look at what is it as an author that makes Anne Brontë distinctive?
I think compared to Anne and Emily, Charlotte and Emily, Anne was writing, she was trying to capture some realism in her works, where we have some kind of fantastical and very gothic elements in Charlotte and Emily's books. Anne was, to some extent, looking at similar issues. So she was very much a feminist, and we can kind of compare some of Anne's characters to Charlotte's characters, such as Shirley and Jane in Jane Eyre. But she has a very distinctive subtlety to the way that she writes, and she's very psychological as well. So I found that a lot of her characters were much easier to relate to, and it was much easier to get into their heads. So Agnes, for example, in Agnes Grey, there's a wonderful passage where Agnes is describing her loneliness, and it pulls you in, because anybody who's been away from home for quite a long time or been in a job where they can't really relate to anybody has probably felt how Agnes felt at that time. And all of her novels especially are full of very kind of human, very relatable characters in that way, and they're all getting their own message across as well. So it's less in your face and more, here's a situation that I can relate to, and it kind of pulls you in that way. I had a friend who, after I'd talked at her about Anne Brontë and why she's wonderful for so long, she went away and read Agnes Grey and came back and said, the way that I got sucked into that was very similar to the way that I got sucked into anything by Sally Rooney, who is, being described as the voice of a generation at the moment, and she's part of that generation. And I thought that was a very kind of good comparison. She's very good at getting into your head in a way that I feel maybe Charlotte and Emily aren't, with their more kind of fantastical, exaggerated characters.
Samantha, let me take that point to you, that it's really startling to hear Anne Brontë described as the sort of the Sally Rooney of her generation. Do you think that there's a danger that we see these authors as canonical writers and we forget the radicalism, the confrontational power that they must have had when these novels, specifically by Anne Brontë, were actually published? It must have caused absolute outrage.
Yes, I definitely think so. I mean, you look at Agnes Grey, and I mean, it is about having a horrible first job and, being treated badly by your employers and ignored by other people in the job. And, your sort of colleagues don't want to talk to you or eat with you. And, it's feeling invisible. We've all been through that. However, at the time, it was one of the first novels, if not the first novel, really, to look at what it was really like to be a governess, what it was really like, how little you got paid, how you got treated, what you were expected to do, how little power you had, the kind of education you were giving to the children, which wasn't great. Boys are basically being taught to, let's make a man of him, i.e. let's make him be horrible. There's a scene in Agnes Grey, in which there's the horrible, nasty Tom Bloomfield, one of her first pupils, wants to torture this nest full of baby birds, and he's saying, I'm going to cut their wings off, I'm going to roast them alive, he's really horrible. He's sort of gloating over this nest. There's something very sexual about it and disgusting about it, and she tries to stop him, Agnes Grey, and she's not that much older than him herself. She's only 19, and she tries to stop him and she can't, so she grabs a large stone and she mercy kills these birds, these baby birds. It's absolutely, it's so shocking when you turn the page and that's what happens, and this was, Charlotte later said that this has happened to Anne. It was what it was really like, as opposed to Jane Eyre, where she has a sort of, sexy boss, a sort of motherly housekeeper, one adorable pupil ends up marrying the boss. This didn't really happen. I'm not in any way saying I don't love the novel Jane Eyre, but it's not an expose of what happened to these young women who were sent with no training, no experience of the world, into these houses where it was very difficult to work. And then the tenant of Wildfell Hall, even more so. This is a woman. The young heroine marries a sexy, dangerous cad, just like Rochester, just like Heathcliff. All the men really fancy.
Not like Rochester.
Well,
hang on.
Has views on Rochester. A little bit like, certainly he's a sexy, dangerous cad. Let's have that. And they get married, and we follow them beyond the altar And we see what it's actually like to be married to one of these men. It's awful. He's an alcoholic. He's abusive in all sorts of ways. He starts abusing their son, giving him alcohol, teaching him to swear, all to make a man of him. He's 4 years old. And she leaves him. And now, I mean, okay, it'd still be difficult to leave in that situation. To leave an abusive marriage is still enormously difficult. But back then, the law would not back you up if you did it, even if, you know, there were no refuges. I mean, you know, but the law would give the child back to the abusive husband, the abusive ex. That's what would happen all the time. So for her to do that, and to then live as a fugitive, supporting herself by her painting, I mean, it's extraordinarily radical. And what's interesting is I think it's still radical today, even though the law has changed. I mean, we know the law should support women, but doesn't always. But then the law didn't support any women. It acted against them. So I think I think you do have to slightly jump back and remember what she was doing and why she was doing it, and who she was hoping would read it and learn from it, and as well as enjoy the novels, of course.
Marianne, I have a great big chunk of time for you now and lots of thoughts and questions to put to you. Let's just dial back to the original question, which was Anne Brontë. Was she radical then, and is she radical now?
She was certainly radical then. Whether you would call her radical now is a matter of definition, really, what you put into that term, radical. But I would like to bring up something that both you, Samantha, and you, Adele, brought up, something that I think is quite overwhelming, and that is the realism, and above all, perhaps the psychological realism of her fiction. And it really hits you, you know, the various scenes, makes you catch your breath. And it's interesting that Anne Brontë has been thought of as the pale, third shadow-like sibling who didn't really count. But I think there is as much strength and passion. You used the expression quiet strength, Samantha, and I think that is so good. Quiet, certainly, but my goodness, it's strong. So radical in the sense that these books and these characters, I liked the way you brought out, Adele, Anne's care with her characters, plenty of them. And she takes great care with her minor characters. They're so carefully worked out. So radical in the sense that nobody can be disinterested in the face of this fiction. And when I first read The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, my first book by Anne that I read it like a teenager. And I was in my mid-30s. And the literary scholar was dormant there. I just read it for the story. And that shows what a strong impact she had, and she has, even on people who are supposedly trained to be analytical. Analysis, no, that came later. It was excitement. When it comes to her political views and values, it again depends on how you define political, but what so impresses me about Anne's character as a person and as a writer is what you called it, strength, and it's a good word for it. Courage, certainly, resilience. And she resists giving in to any notions of victimhood, and that it's there even in her own letters and in her poems. It's nobody else's fault when something is being difficult. She just has to face it. You just have to go through it. And of course, being Christians and her protagonists have that great support in their tribulations. If they hadn't had it, one wonders how they could possibly have coped. But I think that this strength is so overwhelming and so touching too. She was so young.
The title of today's panel discussion is Anne in her own words, and I noted something that Marianne was saying about Anne's poetry being autobiographical, that on the one hand, the Brontes are now an industry. Everyone wants to fantasize about what they were like, what their life was like, what their writing was like. Based on what you have discovered, all three of you are scholars and commentators as well as being readers. Who was Anne to herself? How did she see herself? Adele, let me put that to you first, but it's something I'd like to hear from all of you on.
When you read Anne's poems, especially the ones that were dealing with religious issues, it comes across almost as if Anne views herself as, I don't know how to put this properly, but not quite inferior, but she sees herself as being very human and very prone to making mistakes. But she also realizes that if she's made a mistake, it's then up to her to try and fix that within herself. At times, she's very hard on herself, and you might read the poems thinking, but Anne, you're already doing all of this. You're already, you're trying to do the best that you can for others. You're already putting in a lot of the work to better yourself. But there's a sense that she always felt like she could be doing a little bit better. She wasn't the kind of person to give herself a pat on the back and carry on doing what she's doing. If she felt like she'd made a success, she would then use that as an opportunity to do better next time or keep that momentum going. There are things like, there are poems like Self-Communion and The Three Guides, where she gets very philosophical about what is the best way to live your life, such that you will be a good person, but it's not just you that's having a good life because of that. It's how you affect everybody around you. This is how I see her from the way that I read the poems. I don't think she would see herself quite so positively, because I think she was quite critical and hard on herself, but I think she might have been proud to feel like she wasn't going to give herself too much of a break. There's always, as far as she was concerned, there was always room to improve. But also, she wasn't afraid to be critical of others where she felt like she could do some good. So there are things like, there's a chapter in Agnes Grey called The Cottages, where she is very, very critical of some parts of organised religion at the time as she saw it. So she was a Christian. She was her Christian faith was very strong. It was quite a central part of her character. But when she saw, parsons and anybody within a position of power in the church acting in a way that she didn't think benefited the people they were meant to be serving, she was definitely not afraid to throw some constructive criticism that way.
Samantha, let me bring that to you. How did Anne Brontë see herself? Did she see herself as the sort of less interesting, more nasty, less useful sister?
I don't think she did at all. I mean, I think she really wanted to be useful. She wanted to help people. She wanted people to learn from her experiences. She enjoyed teaching. She didn't always enjoy it. I mean, she had some nightmare pupils, but she worked hard at it. She seems to have been quite good at it. I think she, I'm just going to read you a couple of lines from her last letter, which is going to say it better than I could say it. So this is from Anne's last letter, which was written when she was very ill, and she wanted to go to Scarborough, to the sea, to see if she could get better, and this is what she says to try and persuade a friend of the family to take her. I long to do some good in the world before I leave it. I have many schemes in my head for future practice, humble and limited indeed, but still, I should not like them all to come to nothing and myself to have lived to so little purpose. And I just think that's her all over. You know, she wanted to live to a purpose. She wanted to be of use to the world. I think her faith was very practical, as you know, in many ways, and she wanted to do things in the world. She wanted to write books that would change people's minds and contribute to campaigns that had just been started, you know, for the welfare of governesses, for women who want to leave abusive relationships and abusive marriages. She wanted also to be of use as a teacher. She wanted to be a good sister, a good daughter. You know, she did want to do good, and I think in a very sort of simple way. You know, she wasn't going to become a campaigner herself and go to London, and you know, she was doing what she could do in the way she could do it. She knew she could do it through her words, and she knew she could do certain things to make people around her happier, and that's what she did. And I think that's very kind of something that we all wrestle with is what we should be doing in our lives for the best. And I find it very moving, the idea that you look at what you can do before you sort of, you know, I mean, you know, I would like to save the world as well, but I mean, there are things I can do, and that will I hope make the world better. You know, I'm quite inspired by that, of looking where I might be best of use, you know.
Marianne, let me put those points to you, Marianne, because one of the prevailing cliches about all three of the Bronte sisters, and I think maybe Anne in particular, is that they were away with the fairies, they lived an isolated life, they were not worldly. And of course, we know that that's not true, but I wondered if you could turn that perspective towards Anne Brontë in particular. Was she ambitious? Was she forceful? Was she an agent in her own life rather than just a victim of her own life?
First of all, I would just like to say that I entirely agree with Adele and Samantha on the analysis of what Anne wanted to do with her life. And I think it's stronger in her than in her sisters, that she really did want to be a force for good in the world, and she had thought about it, and that is exactly what you said. I don't think she was ambitious in the sense that she wanted to get on, you know, what Charlotte always used to say. But she didn't want to live to no purpose, as you said, Samantha. And she thought a lot about that and worked hard. You know, she was very self-disciplined intellectually, and she subjected her Bible to systematic study for a year and a half. She tried to teach herself Latin and acquired some Latin by those means. This is not something that you manage to do unless you're dedicated and you have this resolve. I'm going to master this. So a serious person, and I liked so much that expression that you used, Adele, better herself. Quite. It may sound a little old-fashioned, but that's exactly right. There was this great drive for self-improvement, which the Brontes shared with practically everyone in their time. It was the age of improvement, after all. But there's a combination of, on the one hand, the modesty that you brought out so well, Adele, and resolve. This was a strong woman.
Why do you think it is that her writing, her life, her sensibility seems to receive a little bit less attention than those of her sisters? Marianne, let's keep with you on that one, then we'll come to Samantha and Adele.
Right. Well, first of all, her works, when they appeared, were not very favourably reviewed. Not only were people appalled by the Tenant of Wildfell Hall, but the various critiques of her fiction tended to suggest that this was the least powerful of the bells. And I think that is a point that should be made, because we tend to blame Charlotte and Charlotte only, don't we, for the neglect of Anne. But there was this sense from the start that somehow there was less vigor and originality in her writing, that certainly than there was in Wuthering Heights. And can you imagine a less suitable companion than Wuthering Heights for Agnes Grey within one volume? Obviously, the contrast can't have been very helpful there. So I think the idea that Anne was the more negligible, the less talented Bronte stuck around for many, many years. And it really only started to change in the mid-20th century, and not fast either, because that is when commentators on the Brontes began to introduce Anne in their discussions, but it was still more or less taken as read that she wasn't quite as good as her sisters. And that stays with us up until the 1970s and 80s, and then feminism happens in the Academy. And that is really Anne's big break.
Adele, I want to bring you in here. There's a lot to unpack there, so I'll just sort of talk together. The first is really, if we go back to the beginning, why is it that Anne Bronte was seen as somehow lesser than the writing of her two sisters? And then how has critical reception changed in the ensuing 2 centuries?
I agree with Marianne that it's something that's been around from when Anne's novels first appeared. So The Tenant of Wildfell Hall actually sold really well, I think because quite a few people were shocked by it, and so everybody wanted to read this, very shocking book by one of the mysterious Bell brothers, and it was so kind of radical for the time. It dealt with a lot of things that people didn't really want to talk about. So things that people knew were happening, but, let's not in polite society, please. We don't really want to talk about these things or acknowledge them. And after Anne's death, Charlotte was approached by her publisher, who said that he wanted to republish Anne and Emily's novels. Charlotte said that she felt that The Tenant of Wildfell Hall was a complete mistake and should not be republished. So it then went out of print until I think it was 1854. And then a very, very different version of The Tenant of Wildfell Hall came into existence. And I know that some scholars refer to this edition as a mangled text or a butchered text. It was altered quite dramatically. So there was a whole chapter removed. And in that chapter, Helen Huntingdon is talking about how worried she is that her husband seems to be jealous of their infant son. So, that was quite a substantial and very important chapter to lose. And they made a lot of changes to cut down printing costs. So there were no more italics in the text. They also got rid of a few other things that they didn't think, polite audiences wanted to read. And so up until maybe the 70s, 80s, that edition of The Tenant of Wildfell Hall was the only one that you could read in the UK. That it was presented as complete and unabridged. And if you read that version, you get a very, very different feeling of the kind of writer that Anne was. It's almost unrecognizable from the original. So you've got all of these people who already come to the text thinking that Anne is not as talented, not as creative, not as good a writer as her sisters, and they read this text and it just kind of reinforces that idea. So not only have you got kind of Charlotte saying that Anne wasn't quite as original as Emily, and then you've got the first biographer of Charlotte, Elizabeth Gaskell, reinforcing that. You've then got a text that's been heavily edited that almost proves it. And even now, you read an introduction to Anne's work, and even the people who love her often will kind of make an excuse or say, well, I know she's obviously not as good as her sisters and she's not a genius, but and I sit there and I read them and I think, but you're introducing her work and you obviously love what she's written. Why do you feel like to enjoy Anne's work and to think of her to celebrate her in a literary sense, why do you then feel like you have to apologize for having inferior taste? It feels very unfair, but you can kind of see how that's happened. And I feel
Thank you.
Yeah.
I just want to bring Samantha in here because you're nodding in agreement. Samantha, you're part of the move to save Anne Bronte from her own bad reputation and unfairly bad reputation. How you have been part of this movement towards kind of restoring her? What kind of excavation work did you have to do to unpick a lot of that stitching over the last 200 years?
Well, I mean, one of the things I had to do was, as Adele said, there's this mutilated edition, which it turned out the one I'd read as a teenager was the mutilated edition. So, and I would have been bought that in the 80s. So these, you know, they're still around. You can still buy them now. I actually sat down side by side with that and the full text just to look what I mean, it's so violent, the edit. It's awful. If it happened to one of us, we'd be absolutely one of those things where you ring the editor and just go, I'm never working with you again. It's horrible. The other thing that really confused me was she's often described as being her writing as being very sweet. And for a long time, I mean, a lot of editions still of Agnes Grey have this quote by this writer George Moore, who said in the 1920s that the book was as simple and perfect as a muslin dress. It makes it sound really kind of airy and sweet and girlish. I mean, this is a book in which someone kills a load of birds with a stone. I mean, you know, and there's also some other savage stuff. There's a woman marrying off her daughters with this kind of absolute kind of mercenary cruelty. She marries this one of them off to this man who just seems dreadful. He's a gambler. He's unfaithful. He's older. He's rich. That's the only good point about him. That's why she's marrying him. But he's basically just he's a rake. He's a nasty older rake, and she just shoves her daughter into marriage. And we see the cruelty of it, and the sort of savagery is very, very clear. There's a lot of savagery in that book, and he just this was missed, you know. And I think this idea of her as sweet is a real problem. I mean, there's undoubtedly, we've talked about her sort of wanting to be a force for good. There's a kindness, there's an altruism. I'm not saying she was mean, but I don't know. She's not a sweet little girl. She's not kind of candy floss. You know, this is kind of, and I think that partly does come from Charlotte's kind of obituary of both of her sisters, where her sort of brief biographical notice of both her sisters, which does characterize Anne as kind of meek and gentle, and you know, all of these things, making her seem kind of fluffy and sweet. At the time, both Agnes Grey and the Tenant of Wildfell Hall were accused of being coarse and morbid and brutal. And so it was like digging through all the different, you know, you get the sweet and you're going, hang on. And then you dig under that, you get the coarse and morbid and brutal. Okay, but that's not the whole story. And then you dig under that and you know, it takes quite a long time to get at these books without everything that's been sort of encrusted on them, I think. So it did feel like excavating. I think for me, one of the things that was most powerful was after Tenant of Wildfell Hall came out and had all these funny reviews, but was selling amazingly well. I sold out in 6 weeks, the first edition, and she then wrote a preface to the second edition, and this really is, you know, Anne saying what she thinks, you know, and she says all sorts of things in that preface about how a woman can write whatever a man can write, because everyone was fiercely speculating on who these Bell brothers were and who had written these books. And she didn't think anything that a woman could write should be considered morbid or coarse if a man could write it too. You know, we shouldn't have to only write, I keep using the word sweet, these sweet, lovely, girlish things. We should be able to write morbid and coarse and nasty stuff too if we wanted political stuff and radical stuff. And she does really kind of set out her manifesto for what she thinks we should be doing and can be doing. And in the end, I found that the best guide to her work, and I went via that, and then found all these 70s critics, as Marianne pointed out, the sort of the feminists who in the 70s really kind of rescued Anne, and but I found them later. They don't come up in the first Google search. Unfortunately, they should, but you've still got this old, difficult, and I think misunderstandings and wrongful assessments of her.
Marianne, let's go back to the source and the beginning, at the time when all three sisters were alive and writing and trying to forge their way in the world. Anne's relationship with her sisters, we often see them as a three, and yet that they must have had all sorts of ructions and collaboration and competition between them.
I'm sure they had certainly collaboration. I'm not so sure about competition. A lot has been said about Anne Bronte's second novel, The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, as commentary and implicit criticism of her sister's works. And I can see why people have raised that possibility, but I've never seen a really strong argument with convincing examples there. One thing I think we should bear in mind when we're being critical of Charlotte, as any Anne Bronte fan must be, at least in a limited sense, the world would never have heard of the Brontes of Haworth if it hadn't been for Charlotte's drive and energy. She was the only one of Patrick Bronte's 6 children to have inherited that drive. And if it hadn't been for her determination that they should get on, that they should be published, and that they should find audiences and earn money, which was important, certainly important to Charlotte, then we wouldn't be having this discussion. So we owe Charlotte a lot. I also want to say about this fluffiness and prettiness that Samantha brought up, that I think there's a lot of really horrifying stuff in Agnes Grey. Think of those schoolroom scenes, for instance. I can barely bear to read them myself. When she runs after the children and catches them to sit them down and blocks their egress from the schoolroom physically. It's very physical. And she shakes Marianne and pulls her hair. So not a lot of sweetness there. And somehow the most overwhelming detail is when she makes a little boy write the line that she has given him as a task by grabbing his hand and forcing his hand to move up and down so that the line is in some way completed. My favorite quotation from Anne Bronte's own work is from Agnes Grey. "Patience, firmness, and perseverance were my only weapons, and these I resolved to use to the utmost." I have a little postcard bought in Haworth in my study above my desk, and I look at it often.
I actually want to bring up that point about buying the postcard and sort of visiting the house. Adelle, if I start with you, and then I'll circle back around. Adelle, I'm very wary of the fetishization of the Bronte sisters. People from all over the world seem to want to visit their childhood home. They want to see where they lived and what kinds of things they had. Why do you think there's such interest in these writers as women and as personalities rather than just as working artists?
I think the fascination with the Brontes has been there since their books first came out. So originally you would have had 3 very, very different books that all came out around the same time, all written by somebody with the surname Bell. And the pseudonyms that they used were, so they were Currer, Charlotte, Ellis, Emily, and Acton, Anne. They weren't particularly masculine names, but they definitely weren't, feminine names. They were very kind of mysterious. These Bell brothers were very mysterious. And so you already had people trying to work out who they were. And a lot of people a lot of critics tried to solve the mystery of the gender of the authors. I think that there was one critic who said that whoever wrote Agnes Grey must have either been a governess or paid them very well for their information, because they got into the head of the governess so well. So the fascination with who they were was there right from the very beginning. And then obviously after Emily and Anne had died, Charlotte outed herself to the public, and she then wrote the biographical notice of Ellis and Acton Bell in future editions of Wuthering Heights and Agnes Grey, which gave a very, very romantic explanation for the books that Emily and Anne had written, and kind of made Emily out to be this wild child of the moors, kind of away with the fairies. And this is where Anne's reputation as very pious and very quiet kind of came from. And I agree with Marianne that we shouldn't be too critical of Charlotte, because, you know, I think her motivation for this kind of thing came from a place of wanting to protect the identity of her sisters, and wanting to protect them from everyone who was calling them coarse and vulgar. And I think Charlotte thought, well, you know, if people think that their works are coarse and vulgar, I can at least give them an explanation for this by saying that they weren't very worldly, they didn't really know much better, that kind of thing. So Charlotte then kind of set up everyone else to be, you know, even more fascinated with them. So how on earth could somebody who didn't really like people, didn't socialize very much, write something like Wuthering Heights? And how could somebody like Anne, who's very quiet and maybe doesn't like to talk to people that much, how on earth did she write things like Agnes Grey and Wildfell Hall? And that's something that's continued over the last almost 200 years. And then we have Charlotte Bronte's first biographer, Elizabeth Gaskell, who made out like Haworth was a very kind of grim, well, it kind of was a grim place to live at the time, but she made out like their childhoods were incredibly grim, and that they didn't experience much happiness, and they didn't get to speak to many people outside of the parsonage, which was completely untrue. And so we have kind of myths built on top of myths that have perpetuated over the last couple of 100 years, which...
Let me just put those 2 points to Samantha and Marianne. Samantha, to what extent do you feel that the Brontes colluded in their own myth making, and how much of that also was a kind of healthy desire to to play the game and to get famous and be remembered? I mean, these aren't contemptible desires, it's perfectly natural.
I sort of love that they chose these androgynous names. As Adele said, they weren't actively masculine names, you know. Charlotte often would write in this slightly kind of macho tone, you know, to editors and stuff. But Anne and Emily didn't really sort of do that. They had these androgynous names, and and Anne said that she could write anything a man could, you know. She didn't see why men and women should write differently. I think they all did like their privacy. I mean, I think there is something fascinating about three siblings all writing these extraordinary works. You know, you sort of don't really expect to have that much concentration of talent in one family. And then I think they were making their own myths, and I think that's part of the appeal. It's absolutely, I agree, not contemptible. I mean, I think one of the things I love about all three of the Brontes, and poor old Branwell as well, actually, is that they started out as children who had a very tough time. They lost two of their sisters at this horrible failing school, which we know all about from Jane Eyre. They'd lost their mother. They didn't have much money. Their father experienced anti-Irish racism, and so did they. They all had like Irish accents, and they didn't get much formal education. You know, they had a lot to contend with early on, and they escaped into their imagination and they created these fantasy worlds. And then, in a sense, even when they become more realist in their writing, they go on doing this. They go on find the page somewhere they can go to work out what's happening in their lives, which I think a lot of people do, whether in writing or painting or however you do it. But there's something very exciting about the way they made that they were able to escape the horror and to learn to be who they wanted to be, to work things out, to understand the world, to do all of that through writing. So then the writing itself is almost like magical. This is how they've done it. So we read it to find out how they did it. And I find that very powerful. I mean, I find the juvenilia, what we have of it, sort of exhilarating, not because it's necessarily great writing, but because I think I did that. I imagined things. I mean, my 3-year-old son does that stuff, not writing, but.
I just want to give Marianne last words here, because Samantha, you mentioned magic, and Marianne, you entered the piece of evidence that is the postcard that you bought from Haworth. So my first question is a really very soft one, which is, what is the magic of Haworth? Why would one want to go? What do you gain from being there? But also, really, what does it tell us about Anne and her life?
Well, Anne loved her home. Well, all the Brontes did. Emily literally couldn't live away from her home, but it had a similarly strong pull for Anne. And it is quite a place, and it is quite a story, isn't it? I mean, myths, okay, and myth making and all the rest, I don't disagree. But my goodness, what a tale this is, the tale of the Bronte family. And not just about the girls. Think about Patrick Bronte's path from an Irish farmer's cabin to a position of quite some distinction in the Anglican Church. They were extraordinary. Their lives were extraordinary. I'm sorry, but there it is. But something that this myth-making has entailed that is not so favourable is the idea that the works of the Brontes are all about wildness on the moors, more or less, because they engaged so intelligently and in such a well-read fashion with the great issues of their own time. They were extremely well-read and knowledgeable. And this is an aspect of Bronte scholarship that has really come into its own over the last 30 years or so. But there's still a lot of work to be done, and a very good place to do it is in the library of the Bronte parsonage. So that is another reason to visit Haworth. But I would recommend anyone who wanted to go there to spend at least one night in Haworth and be there when the buses disappear and a hush falls over the village, and then walk about it. There's magic there, all right.
My very last question is actually a way of opening the door to anyone who has been with us for the past hour and just wants to know more. So starting with you, Adelle, and then Samantha, and then Marianne, I'm going to invite you to address us all, give your full name, and just tell us one thing that surprised you about Anne Brontë during the course of your research and your scholarship, and also your lives as passionate readers. Adelle.
My name is Adelle Hay, and one thing that surprised me about Anne Brontë when I first read her works was her incredibly strong social conscience and how she was determined to get her messages across and do her little bit of good in the world.
That's absolutely wonderful. Samantha?
My name is Samantha Ellis, and one thing that surprised me about Anne Brontë was her courage. Her last words were "take courage," and it runs through her whole life, and I do take courage from her.
And my name is Marianne Thormählen in Britain. What I admire most of all is the psychological astuteness, the acute observation of human behavior, which is as fresh now as it was when it was first written. Actually, Anne was better at dialogue than any of her sisters, and it comes across even today. And then that power beneath the outwardly quiet personality. And she was funny too.
That is the perfect way to end what has been a fascinating, inspiring and enriching hour. Thank you very, very much indeed. Thanks to the Bradford Literature Festival, I have been Bidisha, and we have been celebrating Anne Brontë in her own words. Thank you and enjoy the rest of the festival.